Total War Warhammer 2 has a lot of information to learn, and one of the biggest parts of that is all the factions and the differences between them, and how to play them. One of the most common questions I get asked is which faction should I learn first? That's what I'll attempt to answer here today, so if you're a new player, this will hopefully help you make the decision on which faction to really sink some time into to get you properly into the game. So, the Total War Warhammer franchise currently has 15 factions playable in the game. That's a lot to learn, a lot to try and choose from. And honestly, TLDR, there is really no wrong answer specifically, but there are certainly ones that can make things harder for learning the game overall. Also, all factions are not created equal, and some require very specific tactics and styles of play to really be effective, and if you don't know how to play a faction, it can be very frustrating if you keep losing, but you don't really know why. Now, for a lot of people who come into a game like this with all the faction choices, I think they already kind of have a preference. We all have a certain faction that we're naturally drawn to. Maybe you watch Lord of the Rings and you really like the Dwarfs. Maybe you played through Skyrim as a High Elf and you really like High Elves. Maybe you've got pet rats so you want to play the Skaven. Or perhaps you're just into necrophilia and you want to play an undead faction, although you should probably go to the police station and hand yourself in. Most of us will have a race preference that we will gravitate toward. And if you have a certain faction that you really lean strongly towards, I would say play that faction, because an affinity towards a certain race could help you keep going maybe when things get frustrating, and you'll just overall be more into the faction. So that's the first question to ask yourself. Do I have any faction that I'm particularly drawn to? Or maybe a few factions that you're thinking about and you can't decide which one? Well, there are some deeper questions we can go to try and make that decision. Firstly, do you have any kind of playstyle preference in games? Do you generally play quite aggressive? Do you play more defensive? Do you prefer to be a sneaky rogue type? Do you like to experiment and try out some risky strategies? Whatever your preferred playstyle, there's probably a faction or two that's geared towards that end. The Norskins, Greenskins, Vampire Counts, Beastmen and Chaos could all be considered aggressive factions. They're best charging up on the enemy quickly, attacking, not really messing around with missiles and artillery and skirmishing, just getting stuck into the enemy and closing the distance quickly. But maybe you prefer more of a defensive playstyle, using missiles and artillery, taking your time, wearing your opponents down and not rushing anything. Well, the Vampire Coast, Empire, Dwarfs, Skaven and Wood Elves can all be pretty strong at this kind of playstyle. And then the remaining factions, High Elf, Tomb Kings, Bretonnian, Lizardmen, Dark Elves, are kind of flexible and could do either. But honestly, pretty much all factions could go in the flexible category because they can all be kind of aggressive or defensive if you'd rather. The Empire can play aggressive if they want to, so can the Skaven. The Greenskins can play defensive, they've got plenty of artillery and missiles. The Beastmen could even play defensive, they've got some options too. It's only maybe the Vampire Counts who can't play anything but aggressive because they don't have any missiles or artillery, and the Dwarfs who can't really play anything but defensive very well because they don't have any good fast flanking units. But understand that all factions are designed for a certain thing. Greenskins are designed to be an aggressive faction. Doesn't mean you always have to play them that way, but that's just how they've been designed. If you look at their units and their stats, their strengths and their weaknesses, they're an aggressive faction. So take this into account when deciding who to play, but realize whether you choose a defensive or aggressive faction, they're all pretty flexible. So if you choose the Skaven, you can play defensive for a bit and then you could build a more aggressive army if you want to. It's not wrong or bad to do so, you just have to figure out how to do it well. Because the Greenskins and Skaven aggressive playstyles, for example, are not necessarily the same. One last question you could ask yourself is, do I have any preference to any kind of unit? Do I really like monsters? If I do, maybe I want to play one of these monster heavy factions so I can have some fun with all the monster type units. Or maybe I'm into guns, bows and things that explode, so having a faction that has a lot of good firepower will allow me to blast my enemies to scheisse. Or maybe you love a good horse and cavalry is your bag. Well, any of these factions have great cavalry that you could have a lot of fun with. Or maybe you like to do your enemies dirty with sneaky traps, vanguard deployment and stalk, a little now you see me now you don't. Well, any of these factions can have that kind of playstyle well. So whether you're into infantry, cavalry, missiles or whatever, every faction will either have or not have these units, and some will be better than others, so you can do some research to find out which one has strong units that you might enjoy using. If you want to use a lot of firepower and missiles, you're not going to want to play the Vampire Counts. If you want to hammer people with cavalry, you're not going to want to play the Skaven. So just another thing to consider when trying to choose your faction. Now, with all that being said, are there any factions that are better or worse to learn first? Are there any advantages to learning from certain factions, or any disadvantages to playing certain factions first? Well, quite simply, yes. But it's only one faction that is really probably a bad idea to try and learn first, because they play so differently from everyone else. Any Total War Warhammer veteran has probably guessed, it's the Dwarfs. These little fellas are super tough and super easy to play because you can actually win without even playing, which I've demonstrated in a video before. Just put them in a box, don't touch anything, and they will win against the AI no problem, in some cases. This is just because the Dwarf faction is built to be sturdy as hell. They have a lot of armor, a lot of leadership, and a lot of melee defense, which makes them very tough, very good endurance. They'll mostly just outlast every other faction through sheer toughness, which is all well and good. That's what Dwarfs do. The trouble with this though, for you trying to learn the game, is that this playstyle really doesn't translate to any other faction. No faction can do what the Dwarfs do. And quite simply, their stats carry you, especially in campaign, where you can get buffs to their leadership and their melee defense. You basically end up with an army of unbreakable units, which makes the game kinda easy. Now, the reason this is bad for you is that, let's say you come in to play Total War Warhammer and the first faction you ever play is the Dwarfs, and let's say you put 50 hours into the Dwarfs. You'll start to learn how to play the Dwarfs, that's great, and then you go to play some other faction for the first time. You might start to find that you get absolutely smashed, and hey, you're not as good as you thought you were. But it's because the Dwarfs play so differently and are so powerful on their own that their strengths and the way you need to play them doesn't really translate to anyone else. Even other defensive factions can't do things the same way the Dwarfs do. No other faction can grind down their enemies and just outlast them the same way. So when you play the Dwarfs, there's a lot of skills and tactics and things that you would have to do with other factions to win that you don't have to do with the Dwarfs, and you'll never bother doing because you won't need to. So it just makes learning the other factions a little bit slower because there's a lot you don't get to do with the Dwarfs. You don't get to mess around and micro cavalry. You don't get to learn how to use skirmish units. You don't get to learn how to play aggressive and push on an enemy. You don't get to learn how to flank properly. There's just a lot here that you're not learning that you would be learning with other factions, which can make your progress a little bit slower when learning the game. So if you compare this to a well-rounded faction that has some decent infantry, decent missiles, decent cavalry, a couple of monsters like the High Elves for example, there's a lot more you can learn from playing the High Elves because there's a lot more tactics you can pull with all the different varieties of units. Dwarfs is mostly infantry. Pretty much every other faction has a good mix of different kinds of units. And when it comes to multiplayer, the Dwarfs are often the newer player's faction of choice because they have an easier time winning with them, because those stats will carry them. Against another newer player who doesn't really know how to beat the Dwarfs will probably win. But not because the player played well, simply because he played the Dwarfs. I actually have a really good example video of this, which is taken from a stream where we had 3 different skill level players play against a slightly newer player playing the Dwarfs, and you can see the different approaches of a complete noob, a slightly more experienced player but still quite new, and a high level player. And you can see the different approaches to taking on the Dwarfs and how much easier it is for the Dwarfs taking on the 2 newer players who don't really know how to beat them compared to the higher level player who does know how to beat them. I'll link that video at the end of this video anyway if you want to check that out. So, the Dwarfs may not be the best faction for you to learn first because they will carry you and deny you a lot of tactics that are used by other factions. That being said, if you're really into Dwarfs though, just play the Dwarfs, it's fine. But understand that you're not learning everything you need in this game, and when you play another faction and you suck, don't be surprised. But that's okay. You can learn the other stuff from playing other factions, but the Dwarfs will make it a little bit easier for you in battle. Another faction that can be problematic for newer players is the Empire. Naturally one of the more popular factions in the game, the main human faction, the closest thing to represent us, right? Naturally they're very popular. But the trouble with the Empire is that while they have a pretty well-rounded army, their infantry isn't great, and it really requires a lot of support and micro-intensive action to be played properly and effectively. Now this of course is very difficult for newer players, and they'll probably shy away from this, or they'll find that their infantry is getting smashed early, their front lines aren't holding on very long and they don't know why, and it's probably because they're not buffing them and looking after them. Empire front lines really need the support of a lord or a warrior priest to help them out. So without the strong infantry for the Empire, what do they have? Cavalry. Cavalry is one of their strongest assets. They've got some fantastic cavalry, some of the best in the game, but a lot of cavalry can be a lot to micro for a newer player. Even 3 units could be a lot for a new player, when you could have 4, 5 or 6 units being a good amount of cavalry. So what tends to happen for these players that don't understand the Empire is they resort to this. Having like 10 units of artillery, because the Empire has great artillery and that's something to take advantage of. However, if you spam artillery and bring like 8 or 10 units in an army, you're probably blowing the enemy army up before it even reaches you, right? Which is maybe fun for a battle or two, and if all you want to do is win, then, well, that's fine. Go for it. But you're not going to learn anything about how to play Total War. You're just blowing up stuff that's descending on you before it reaches you, which actually means that you're not playing Total War at all. You're actually playing Space Invaders. Think about it. It's literally what you're doing. You're just shooting stuff before it gets to you. And this brings you the same problem as the Dwarfs. If you play this way and just blow stuff up with artillery before it gets to you, you learn nothing about the game that is translatable to other factions, other than playing other factions with lots of good artillery and blowing everything up too. But again, not really getting anywhere on learning how to play actual Total War. So by all means, play the Empire and any other artillery strong faction. But realize if you turn it into Space Invaders, you're not learning anything useful about how to play the Empire or any other faction. So those are the main 2 pitfalls to watch out for, I think. The Dwarfs will carry you, and the Empire is harder to play than you think. One other thing that can be a slight issue, which is only small to be honest, is undead factions. The Vampire Counts, Vampire Coast and Tomb Kings all play a little bit differently than everyone else because they're undead, which means they don't rout and run away. So again, if you played 50 hours of the Vampire Counts before you played any other faction, you get used to the units never routing and always staying where you put them until you pull them away or they die. This will get you very comfortable with things never routing, so when you then go and play the Skaven, for example, who like to rout and run away a lot, you'll be very confused and you'll feel like you're losing, when in fact it's just a natural part of playing the Skaven. So understand that undead factions and their non-routing mechanic means they just play a little bit differently than most other factions. It's not a huge difference, it just means you need to be a little bit more careful with your matchups when playing undead, because you can lose strong units very quickly. Don't be put off playing undead factions though, they've got a lot of translatable skills and tactics that you have to use which will work for a whole bunch of other factions which will help you learn Total War, but just realize you're working with a slightly different mechanic than most other factions. So now that hopefully you have some ideas on how to narrow down the choice of which faction to play, it won't be so daunting as a newer player when you see this, a list of endless amounts of possibilities of campaigns you could play. So you can narrow down which factions you like the look of, and then it's simply a case of deciding which legendary lord you want to play. You can look at all the different mechanics of all the different factions. Honestly, again, there's no right or wrong answer on which campaign you should play first. Maybe avoid the hordes though, like the Beastmen and Chaos, Nikai the Wanderer, because they play very differently than most of the other legendary lords. But for the most part, Total War remains the same whichever faction you play. You expand, take more territory, protect the territory you've got, make allies, improve your economy, make more money, get more armies, take over the entire map, blah blah blah. Pretty much every faction has those goals, they just have different ways of getting there, so they're not actually vastly different. One thing to maybe pay a little bit of attention to is the initial challenge on any faction. You can see on Manfred here it's easy, so he's going to have a pretty easy start. Grimgor, it's normal. Skarsnik is hard. This is just going to mean that it's a little bit tougher at the start of the campaign, but it will even out and be pretty much the same, and you'll probably start to steamroll everybody eventually anyway, as that's how pretty much all campaigns end up. But maybe stick to the easy or normal ones for your first campaign so you can get used to things without having too much of a challenge, although of course it depends on the difficulty you choose as well. And campaigns are a great way to learn factions, rosters and armies as well, because they introduce the units to you slowly. You'll start off with just a handful of units, you'll only be able to have those for a while, so it gives you time to learn them before your roster expands and you'll have more on your plate to choose from. So when you've found whatever faction it is that you want to learn, try to pay attention to the units as you go, learn what their role is within the army, because that's all going to help you learn the faction. When it comes to multiplayer, things are a little bit more complex, and really knowing your factions is very important. I'd recommend to pick 2 or 3 factions that you really enjoy and try to learn those first and get the hang of them before you try learning all 15 factions at once, because that is just far too much for any one human to handle. A couple of important things to understand with multiplayer though. Factions go up and down in strength with updates and DLC for the game. Imagine a kind of ranking of 1 to 15. Some are at the top, some are at the bottom. For example, the Greenskins, Vampire Coast and Tomb Kings are considered some of the strongest factions right now, whilst Bretonnia, the Wood Elves and the Chaos are considered 3 of the worst factions right now. But as of this moment in October 2020, we know that the Wood Elves DLC is a couple of months away, and when that comes along, it's likely that the Wood Elves will go from one of the worst to one of the best. And it's really just a case of factions falling behind and not being updated, like Bretonnia and the Chaos. They're 2 factions that haven't been updated, got any new units or any big balancing changes. They're 2 factions that have just fallen behind with all the new big fancy stuff that all the updated factions are doing. They need updates to bring them up to speed. So just be aware of that as well. If you go into multiplayer and you want to play Bretonnia, realize that you're going to have a little bit of a harder time than somebody who decides to main the Vampire Coast. This is just down to some factions having stronger units, stronger abilities, stronger magic, better matchups between factions, because that's another thing to consider. Not all factions are equal in fighting each other. Some factions will have an easier or harder time depending on who they fight. Take Bretonnia for example, they'll generally have a hard time with most other factions, except maybe the Wood Elves. They can put the Wood Elves in the bin pretty well because they got a lot of cavalry, Wood Elves rely on a lot of missiles, so that can be a good matchup for Bretonnia. Doesn't mean they're guaranteed to win, just means they have a better chance of having advantages over the other faction. But that's a whole nother story for another day. I imagine if you're new to the game and watching this video, you're probably not too interested in diving into multiplayer just yet. Although if you are, you can join my Discord if you like, there's a link in the description if you're looking for a friendly environment to get into multiplayer with people who will help you learn and other noobs to play against, then boogie on down there. So there you go. I think that's most of the important points I have to say on this question. Whenever people ask, I always have to say this, so now it's in a video and I could just link them to this instead. Happy days. For the most part though, as I've said a bunch of times, really there is no wrong answer for which faction to learn first. If you have a particular affinity, I'd go with that for the most part. No faction is really so terrible. It's not like Bretonnia, for example, can never win anything because they're pretty bad right now. They can still be made useful by a good player by all means. But it perhaps does mean that for a newer player it can be harder to really get them to work because their faction just isn't that strong right now. But like I say, in campaign there's no real wrong answer because you're only playing with yourself, so it doesn't really matter. In multiplayer there are kind of some wrong answers or some tougher answers that you may not want to take on as a newer player, but it all can be learned either way. You can get good with Bretonnia and you could be a good Bretonnia player if you want to take the time. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed this, thanks for watching, I'll see you in the future.